Lightning Ridge has appeared in films several times, including the recent film Strange Colours and the 2000 film The Goddess of 1967, which is responsible for one of Lightning Ridge's strangest tourist attractions, this corrugated iron church that was transported here as part of the Goddess film set and now remains permanently on the 3-mile opal field just outside of town. But Lightning Ridge's film history goes back a lot further, long before modern films, long before colour film, and almost before Lightning Ridge was even a place. If you're a fan of Clint Eastwood or maybe a fan of Quentin Tarantino's latest film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you're probably familiar with spaghetti westerns, which were low-budget Wild West movies made in Europe in the 60s and 70s. The most successful was probably the Dollars trilogy, which was a fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. But what you might not know is there's also a thing called a meat pie western, which were American-style Wild West movies that were made in Australia. The first movie described as a meat pie western was probably The Man from Snowy River in 1982, but the description has been applied retroactively to a lot of older films, particularly those that were filmed in Australia but kept largely to the American formula for a cowboy movie, even when it didn't really make any logical sense. And Lightning Ridge, which has always been at the frontier of Australia's Wild West, and kind of still is, featured in one of them. Kind of, except it didn't. I will explain. The Shadow of Lightning Ridge was a silent film made in 1920. It was directed by Wilfred Lucas, written by Bess Meredith, and starred athlete and sportsman Snowy Baker and American actress Agnes Vernon. And there are two really important things that I need to tell you about The Shadow of Lightning Ridge that will make you wonder why I'm even making this video at all. The first is that it doesn't exist anymore. It's considered a lost film, so while some of Snowy Baker's films are archived at the National Film and Sound Archive, there's some links in the description, The Shadow of Lightning Ridge is just lost to the ages, and all we have left is an image of the film poster and a few newspaper articles. The second thing that'll make you wonder why I'm doing this is that The Shadow of Lightning Ridge wasn't actually filmed in Lightning Ridge, and as far as I can determine, it was barely even set in Lightning Ridge, but it's still fascinating that Lightning Ridge got mentioned prominently in a movie in 1920 when you consider how relatively new the town was at the time. Lightning Ridge was only officially named a few years before the film was made, and at the time the town of Lightning Ridge had barely spread from the original settlement on the opal fields to where the town's currently located. The plot of the film is not particularly complicated, and it's largely borrowed from the story of Zorro, a story which was first published in 1919 and was gaining some popularity at the time. I've pieced together the following outline of the story of The Shadow of Lightning Ridge based on various sources, one of which is Wikipedia, so your mileage may vary, but hopefully it's a fairly faithful reconstruction of the original plot. One thing though that I'm not certain about and I haven't been able to figure out from the information I can find is the time frame that the film was set in. It was made in 1920, but it's a cowboy story that features some really period specific things, so I would speculate it's probably set back in the late 1800s. I have no clue though. I don't know that anybody necessarily does. So we start in a train carriage where a rich guy, Sir Edward Marriott, is on his way to Lightning Ridge to pay the miners that he has working for him. He has his fiancée Dorothy Harden with him, and there's also a suspicious character in the carriage with a loud cough. The train is interesting because the bulk of the railway to Walgett, the nearest station to Lightning Ridge, didn't open until 1908. So if the story is set any earlier than that, then the railway really shouldn't exist. But it's entirely possible that not a great deal of research went into this story, but who knows. Anyway, along the way there's some kind of scuffle. A vehicle, probably a horse-drawn wagon, and some bad guys show up, and the dude with the cough reveals himself to be the villain of the story. He steals the money from Sir Edward Marriott, and he steals Dorothy's jewellery, and he hops on a horse and rides away. So the dude with the cough is the Shadow, basically a knockoff of Zorro, who seeks vengeance against Sir Edward because Sir Edward mistreated the Shadow's mother, so make of that what you will. Suddenly, Bushrangers. Edward and Dorothy are attacked, and the Shadow rescues Dorothy, but apparently not Edward. Bushrangers are kind of an interesting addition to the story, which caused all kinds of historical problems, because there were absolutely bushrangers in this area. Captain Thunderbolt held up the hotel in Colorado in the 1870s. But by the 1920s, there were only a few bushrangers getting around, and by then they were no longer really called bushrangers, they were just regarded as common thieves and criminals. But anyway, the Shadow rescues Dorothy and they fall in love, at which point he learns, super conveniently, that he's the heir to Sir Edward's considerable fortune and all of his property, because who needs to plot to make sense in a movie? Then, someone we've never heard of or been introduced to, Portuguese Anne, who is presumably from Portugal and obviously called Anne, appears, deathly jealous of Dorothy, and does her best to get the Shadow to be arrested, but he escapes, and that's basically the entire story. Pretty much the entire point of these movies was the stunts. Snowy Baker was a well-known sportsman and stunt performer of the time, and he became a pretty sought-after actor because he was able to pull off some pretty impressive stunt work. One review of The Shadow of Lightning Ridge mentions some of the daredevilry that was performed in the movie, including jumping from a horse to a moving train, diving with a horse from a high encampment into a deep pool, walking a horse across a bridge made from a fallen tree trunk, and jumping a horse through the roof of a building. Lots of horse stunts and countless fights and chases. And apart from the name and the mention of miners at the very beginning, it doesn't seem like Lightning Ridge is much of the focus of The Shadow of Lightning Ridge at all. Historically, opal mining at Lightning Ridge had really only just started about 15 years prior to the release of the movie, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of precedent for miners being paid a salary from an outside investor to work mines in the area, certainly not during a time that bushrangers patrolled the area. Also, the characters are purely fictional. My 5 minutes of research has suggested that there never was a Sir Edward Marriott, and certainly not in connection with Lightning Ridge. I mentioned earlier that the film wasn't shot at Lightning Ridge. It was actually filmed near Sydney at a place called Bulli Pass and at a studio in Waverley in Sydney's eastern suburbs. As the film is lost, there's no way of knowing if any effort was made to make Bulli Pass resemble the landscape of Lightning Ridge, but it seems very unlikely that they would have made a very accurate representation of the ridge in the 1920s. In fact, I'd probably go as far as to speculate that the filmmakers never actually visited Lightning Ridge at all, or possibly had any idea what it looks like. I wish I could show you more and tell you more, but thanks to the passage of time, the Shadow of Lightning Ridge has turned to dust, which I guess is kind of appropriate, and I suppose gives the film one last unexpected connection to the arid landscape of the opal fields. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing on YouTube so you don't miss out on future videos, and you can follow along on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those channels. Thank you for watching. What you might not know, though, is there's also a thing called a lot of wind.